guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
Four votes. 4 votes difference.
Article 1, 52 senators have voted not guilty, 48 guilty, which is the entire Democratic group. Republican Senator Mitt Romney.
Thank you, Whit.
Article 2.
Thank you, Mitt Romney.
Congress. Reince Priebus, the president's former chief of staff, is with us, and even though the president will be acquitted today and will remain in office, hearing them say guilty, it's still a stunning moment in our history.
Well, look, I think the Democrats started something they knew they couldn't finish. And there was never going to be a time when 20 Republicans were going to convict the president of something that we've talked a lot about the articles that they didn't meet the threshold, and they were going to go for it.
Senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1. Directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2. Directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3. Directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael McMulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty.
Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones,
I want to
Guilty.
know
Mr.
when the
Kane.
hell Senator Inhofe
guilty. Mr.
is
Kennedy,
going to retire or be beat.
not guilty.
That man
Mr.
is
King.
a scourge.
Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey,
We only need him to be
Guilty.
impeached
Mr.
on
McConnell.
one measure.
not guilty. Ms. McSally,
God, I pray that
not guilty.
there would be
Mr.
enough
Menendez,
people to convict him on at least one
Guilty.
article.
Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney, not guilty. Ms.
Really,
Rosen,
Romney? This time not guilty? That is so
Guilty.
bullshit.
Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders,
Thank
guilty.
you,
Mr. Sass,
Senator Sanders.
not guilty. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer,
Thank you, Mr.
guilty. Mr.
Schumer.
Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tellis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren,
Thank you, Miss
guilty.
Warren.
Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young, not guilty.
this time a 6-vote split. The last one was a 4-vote split.
The President of the United States will remain in office as senators have voted in the majority to hold the president not guilty on Articles 1 and 2 in the Articles of Impeachment passed by a Democratic House of Representatives, largely along party lines, except for one exception. Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, who voted with Democrats on Article 1, which is abuse of power, where he voted
This
guilty.
article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment.
It doesn't help that the Republican
Presiding
Senate
officer directs
voted.
judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Order that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Senate McConnell,
Before
Mitch
this
McConnell.
fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge
This
the
man's a
few
traitor
people
to
who
our
helped the Senate
country.
fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands.
Yeah, you refuse to let witnesses or evidence be presented.
That his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel. To commemorate his time presiding over this body, we typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some.
It's like a backwards reward to a judge for siding with them.
Ready to go.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys? So thank you all very much for your good work. And second, to fine men and women of the Capitol Police, we know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day. but the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours, and even more work, and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
I have no complaint with him thanking pages
Chair
or
recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking
law
the
enforcement.
personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol. They were asked to work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I too would like to thank those wonderful pages. I so much enjoyed you with your serious faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice on national television is not how most of us spend our first week at work. But they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the Chief Chamber Attendant. Jim Hoover and the Cabinet Shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial. Brenda Bird and her team did a spectacular job of keeping the Capitol clean, and Lyden Webb and his team will move the furniture and then moved it again and again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
And the chair also wishes to make a very brief statement. I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting. They ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant-at-Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one. I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The chair recognizes the Majority Leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.
And thus ends the era of impeachment, I guess, against President Donald Trump, as the president has been acquitted on both charges.
Shamefully.
Both articles of impeachment against the president, including abuse of power and obstruction of justice. Want to go to Major Garrett, our Chief Washington correspondent, with reaction from there at the White House. Major?
Not from the White House yet, Nora, but from the Trump-Pence campaign 2020. This statement delivered by the campaign chairman, Brad Parscale. President Trump, I quote directly from the statement, has been totally vindicated, and now it's time to get back to the business of the American people. I'm reading again, direct quote. The do-nothing Democrats know they can't beat him, so they had to impeach him. This terrible ordeal was always a campaign tactic to invalidate the 2016 votes of 63 million Americans and was a transparent effort to interfere with the 2020 election. It goes on to say, President Trump's fundraising only grew more robust during this impeachment process. That's certainly what the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign have always represented, and there is some indication, nor the president's approval rating in a series of polls also ticked up slightly as the impeachment process wore on.
All right, Major, thank you. Want to bring in our
As
panel, John
usual,
Dickerson, our senior political
Donald
analyst and
Trump
60 Minutes
is
correspondent,
full of
Mark
shit.
Moderator of Face the Nation's
It was
political
extremely
analyst,
close.
President
I
Trump's
know
first
as a
chief of
legal
staff,
matter,
and
you
CNBC's
have to have
political contributor,
2/3
Joel Payne, a Democratic
of
strategist.
a.
So first to you hear the response.
One
First,
moment.
not from the White House, but from the president's campaign manager, who took a look at this last poll numbers and showed that the president's support, even among his base, actually has grown. One of his best approval ratings thus to date. What do the Democrats do now?
I just want to say that basically, although the law says that you have to have a 2/3 majority in order for a motion to pass, for the president to be found guilty, the thing is the first article impeachment, there was only a 4-vote split. And the second article of impeachment, there was only a 6-vote split. Every one of the Republicans voted not guilty for a man that they know is guilty in so many ways. They care nothing about anything other than keeping other than keeping their position in office. They did not want to risk that. Most of them make lots of money and everything from corporate interests, and I'm not saying that Democrats don't also, but there has never been, I don't think there's ever been a more corrupt president in the United States. Maybe Nixon, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I honestly believe that Donald Trump is the most corrupt president that we have ever had. And what makes the matter worse is that we have the most corrupt Republican Senate going right now. Here we are in the year 2020, and we have been fighting to get Trump, we've been fighting to get Trump impeached. The Senate, it was supposed to be a trial, but they refused to let evidence or witnesses be seen. What kind of a trial is that if you have no witnesses and you have no evidence? Okay? That is not a trial. That is a sham. They did not want anything seen that or heard on the floor during this very public impeachment trial that would disparage President Trump, who is their man. Most of them don't even like Trump, but for some reason, Trump is hugely popular with the extreme right-wing Republican evangelical voters in this country. And I don't even understand that, because the man is a womanizer, he's a misogynist, he's a racist, He is, gosh, like, the list goes on and on. And honestly, I wasn't expecting to be recording this, but so I don't have like an actual list with me right now that I could read off to you. But I just want to say that it has never been more imperative that we all get out the vote and that we vote a Democrat in. I'm not saying Democrats are perfect. They are not perfect by a long shot. I am personally registered as an independent. And the only thing that is going to change that is the fact that I want to be able to vote in the primary in my state, which is Oklahoma. This is a red state, which gives me no end of frustration. Because they have supported Donald Trump and Inhofe. I can't stand that man. He is, well, that's a whole nother story. But in any case, we have to do everything that we can to get a Democrat in office and to vote Trump out. He needs the people of this country to rise up. We need the people of this country to rise up and vote to get him out. He cannot be allowed to run and win a second term in office. The cost to our country's reputation, our country's safety is phenomenal. Okay, the risk is so huge because Trump is willing to drag us into a war with Iran. He's willing to drag us into a war with North Korea, possibly, if it comes down to it. Whatever he has to do, Trump is just keeping the war machine in this country going. And also, he doesn't care one bit about environmental issues or anything. He's done everything he can to completely dismantle the EPA. And climate change is already having a devastating effect on our country. So the reasons to get rid of Trump are many, 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 many. And the reasons to keep him in office have nothing to do with anything good except for they just want to keep getting money in their pockets. The Republicans want to keep getting money in their pockets, and they want to remain in power, and that has to change. We need to have a shift in this country in both the Senate and the House. We shifted blue in the House, but the Senate is still red. It's still strongly red, or red enough, so that this impeachment trial has basically just been a sham. And it's got to stop. It's just got to stop. And I don't know what's going to happen if people don't get a clue about Trump and change their vote for the 2020 election. Lastly, we have to do everything we can to be diligent and hyper-vigilant about international interference in our elections. You know, I think Russia is the one who helped get Trump elected, and he is in their pocket. And it is imperative that we get him out of office. Now, if we get a Democrat in there and they mess up too, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that they're perfect. I'm not saying that they're above reproach or anything like that. But right now, almost anybody would be better than Trump. And right now we need to have a shift to a Democrat in this country again. I guess that is it for now. I've been recording what's been going on TV through this trial for the last 35 plus minutes. I'm going to go ahead and close out now, and this is the first time I've ever recorded and spoken like this, so I know it's rough, I know it's unpolished. This was just done off the cuff. I was not prepared at all. I just came in, I flipped on the TV, saw what was happening, and I had to record, and I had to say a few things, because this is an incredible moment in history that is sadly not a proud one for our country. This is not a proud moment for our country at all. And it needs to be stated unequivocally that Trump is guilty. Republicans just won't act on it because self-preservation. Thank you very much. Signing off.